Today we're going to talk about transport across the cell membrane. As we said in the last podcast, cells must transport materials in and out of their cells in order to maintain homeostasis. Today we're going to focus on something called passive transport, of which there's three kinds: diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. And then next class we'll talk about active transport. Now, this is important to cells because, getting things in and out of your cells is important. So this just helps us understand why cells are so small as opposed to having big cells, right? Why do we have lots of teeny tiny cells like this as opposed to having, say, one big huge cell? And the answer is that when our cells try to take material in or out, it takes way too long in this big cell, and it doesn't take as long in the littler cells. And so that's one reason why cells are so small. Okay, so what is passive transport? Passive transport is moving a substance across the cell membrane without using any energy. Okay, and how that works is that the molecules are always moving. If you think about solids, liquids, and gases, right? What makes a gas is that the molecules are moving really fast. And a liquid, the molecules are moving a little bit slower. And so molecules are always moving, okay? And they have a tendency to move along what's called the concentration gradient, which just means they're going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And they're going to move until they're evenly spread out, which is what we call equilibrium. So when they're all equal, right, equilibrium has been reached. All right, so diffusion is a type of passive transport, and diffusion is just movement of a molecule from a high concentration to a low concentration. So if you look at the picture here, okay, a lot of molecules start off here, they're in a high concentration, and so they're going to move over to here where there's not any of them, so a low concentration, until they're all evenly spread out. Okay, so diffusion could be something like food coloring in water. If you put in the drops, it's highly concentrated and then it spreads out until it's evenly spread out. Of course, I think of other things. Gases move a lot by diffusion. So if the person next to you, they fart, well, you're going to know it in a few minutes. Why? Not because you bent over and smelled it, but because those gas molecules actually moved from an area of high concentration near them to an area of low concentration near you, and that's why you were able to smell it. Other things work like that. Perfume, right? Someone could walk by in the hall and they have on a lot of perfume. Well, those molecules are going to spread into the room and we're going to smell it. So again, moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. Things in your body move by diffusion all the time. Oxygen moves from your lungs into your bloodstream, right? Remember when we did our exercise lab that the oxygen moves from your lungs into your blood, and then your blood carries it to your cells and moves into your cells. Again, all by diffusion, moving from a high to a low concentration. Osmosis is just a very specific kind of diffusion. It's just the movement of water across a selectively permeable membrane. So water moving from a high to a low concentration. And so we can see osmosis all the time when we see things that get dried out. So if we leave out, like last night I left out an orange on the counter. I had peeled it and forgot about it. When I came down the next morning, it was all dried out. And that's just because of osmosis. The water inside of the orange moved out of the orange by osmosis. Okay, so this little video is going to tell us a little bit about osmosis.
A selectively permeable membrane prevents some solutes from crossing from one side of the beaker to the other. In this example, the concentration of solutes is higher on the right side of the membrane than on the left. This means that the concentration of water is lower on the right side than on the left. Because of the concentration gradient and the barrier to solute movement, water molecules must diffuse across the membrane to equalize the concentrations. The diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane is called osmosis. In the absence of opposing forces, the net movement of water across the membrane continues until the solute concentrations on both sides of the membrane are equal. It is common to compare two solutions by their relative tonicity.
I'm just going to fast forward through this a little bit. It's going to go into some vocab, but let's just watch and see here how that applies.
Surrounding a cell affects the water balance of the cell, sometimes with fatal results. In this first example, a red blood cell is placed in a hypertonic solution. The solutes do not cross the cell membrane. The solute concentration is higher outside the cell than inside, so water moves by osmosis from inside the cell to the surrounding solution. This movement of water out of the cell causes the cell to shrink.
Okay, so basically what this is showing here is all these little dots, they're solutes. It could be salt. So if you drank salt water, what's going to happen to your cells? They're all going to shrivel up and die. Why? Because the water out here is really salty. And so there's a lower concentration of water outside your cell. And so what happens is the water moves by osmosis from a high concentration to a low concentration, and then your cells shrivel up and die. So that's why you die if you drink salt water. Not good.
Suppose the cell was dropped in a hypotonic solution. The solute concentration is lower outside the cell than inside, so the water concentration is also higher, and water enters the cell. The membrane swells or even bursts. Plant cells.
Just go back for a second. So in this case, you have more water outside your cell. So this would be like drinking what's called distilled water, which is really pure water. If you drink distilled water, sometimes that distilled water is so pure that there's so much water on the outside, it'll rush into your cells and cause them to burst.
Concentration is also higher, and water enters the cell. The membrane swells or even bursts. Plant cells avoid this problem of rupture in a hypotonic solution. Their stiff cell walls prevent the cell from taking in too much water. Finally, what happens if the cell is dropped into an isotonic solution? Red blood cells in an isotonic solution do not shrink or swell. Water molecules move across the membrane equally in both directions.
Okay, that's because the prefix iso means the same, so if the cells are already the same, nothing's going to happen to it. Okay, so we're going to just skip through this. So again, you have this picture in your notes, okay? So if water moves into the cell gets bigger and can even burst, or lyse. Remember, we learned that lyse means to break apart. Okay, if it's in an isotonic solution, then it's going to stay the same, and if it's in a hypertonic solution, which means the water is going to move out of the cell because, again, there's less water outside, so moving from high inside to low outside, the cell shrivels up, okay, and can die. So we could just look at this again. Here's a red blood cell. If we drop it in water that's isotonic, nothing's going to happen. But watch what happens if we decide to change this to make it a hypotonic solution. Watch what happens when we drop the red blood cell in. Okay, a hypotonic solution. Ooh, bam! The red cell burst because the water concentration on the outside was higher. It moved into the cell, which caused the cell to burst. Okay, so predict what's your prediction. What's going to happen if we put it in this hypertonic solution? It shrivels up because there's more water inside the cell, which has to move out to make it balanced. Okay. Now some living things, they're constantly pumping water out. If water keeps moving in, like we saw the cell that burst, some living things have a vacuole that can actually squeeze the water back out so that they don't keep filling up. All right. Okay, and the last thing is called facilitated diffusion. So people who speak Spanish might know fácil, right, to make easy. So this just means facilitated diffusion means to make diffusion easy. And remember, we saw those yesterday or last class. We saw the transport proteins in the cell membrane, and those are really important. Okay, any molecule that's too large or has a charge requires the transport protein to bring it into the cell membrane. Now it's still moving from high to low, so it doesn't require any energy. Okay, that's why it's still diffusion. Okay, it's just that the transport protein is helping the diffusion. Okay, so if you watch, we're going to watch, let's see, these. We can just watch it happening. We don't need to listen to them. But watch, these are just two different kinds of transport protein. Okay, but the goal is the same. Okay, so over here, a high concentration moving to a low concentration but using the transport protein, and over here again high concentration up top, okay, using a transport protein to move it through. They're just different kinds of transport proteins. Okay, that's it for today.